So last summer, I planned to go to the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage across most of Spain. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can start in France, like I did, in the Pyrenees, or you can walk through Portugal. You can walk from the interior of Spain, or you can walk the northern coast of Spain. And it's a really old tradition. It's somewhere between 1200 and 1500 years old. And people have been walking since that point, where Saint James is said to he had been assassinated or murdered at some point, and his remains were transported to what is now Santiago de Compostela, which is a city in northwestern Spain. And they built the cathedral, and they built the city around this, so people would walk from their hometown to Santiago, and they would pay their respects traditionally. So traditionally it was a Catholic kind of adventure, and one of the main three that you might do in your life as a Catholic. But today, more contemporarily, it's not just a Catholic experience, it's equally as much so spiritualistic, even sometimes atheistic experience. It's a physical test for some people. Some people do it in the name of a loved one or something like that, and they'll bring the remains or some symbolic thing with them, and they complete the length of their journey. And you don't have to start anywhere, but there tends to be starting points where people will travel to the starting point and start walking there. So for me, I started in a town called Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Pont. I think that's how you pronounce it in French. I am awful with French. Which is in the Pyrenees right now, in the Basque region. So I had heard about it through two good friends of mine who lived next door actually right now, and they had just gotten back the year before I went. And it seemed like an incredible experience, not just for the sake of travel, but the sake of kind of, and it's an alternative form of travel. It wasn't just your touristic, kind of consumeristic feel, although it has some elements of that. It I guess has the tendency to be a little bit of a different experience. So I decided to go there, and I started last July, I think the July 11th or July 9th or one of the two. And it took me 33 days, and I got to Santiago, and I walked the entire way. I walked every day except for one day when I had a problem with my foot. And so, yeah, it can take about 30-ish days, but I've known people who've done it in 3 months, and they take a much longer time, walk much shorter distances every day, or start earlier. And I've heard of people who started in Germany, who've started in northern France. I've heard of people who started in England, and they walk to a port and take a boat across, and it's like an entire pilgrimage, the traditional way of walking from your hometown. It's quite a popular experience nowadays. There was a movie made about it in, I think, 2010, 2011,
2010.
Something like that, called The Way. It's an American film. Martin Sheen and Emilio Estevez. And that made it quite popular for people in North America. There's been a lot of authors in Germany that have written books. Germans are quite common on the Camino. A Japanese author made it popular in Japan. Actually Korea. And there has been some Japanese travelers because there's a similar pilgrimage in Japan, I'm told. So yeah, it's quite common to find Europeans and North Americans there, and then a few different populations throughout East Asia. And I think there's hundreds of thousands of people who walk this a year. The most popular route being the route I did, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Pont. The other routes tend to be much more sparsely populated. But the idea is that you walk, or bike. You can bike, and there's a few other things that people will do. I've heard of people. It might have been a joke, but there was somebody talking about taking one of those segways on the Camino, which I honestly think it was a joke. You cannot drive. You cannot take a bus. You can't take a taxi cab. if you're doing it right. You're welcome to, but the idea is you have a passport that you will acquire before you start your journey, and every night that you stay in some kind of hostel or you eat at a restaurant that is Camino themed, if you will, you get a stamp to kind of prove that you did this journey. And the idea being that anyone who walks it will have collected enough stamps by the end of it to kind of like signify they did the entire way. Sometimes they actually go through and check the stamps to make sure you didn't cheat and jump a big skip a big portion of it, but for the most part it's just kind of a symbol to get the passport done. It's quite common for Spanish people to actually do it and throw it on their resumes, but they'll only do the last 100 kilometers, so you need a minimum of 100 kilometers in order to get this certificate of completion. It's this cheap piece of paper that everyone gets if you go stand in line at the pilgrim's office, and you can frame it. A lot of people have a frame to prove that they did it. So it's quite common for Spanish people to start them exactly 100 kilometers from Santiago so they can put it on their resume, and it's supposed to be like a hireable feature. I don't think it's very common for anyone else outside of Spain to do that, but yeah, you get a lot of French people that will do it on their vacation time, so they'll go 2 weeks at a time because that's as much as they're able to take off at once, and every year they'll go do that, and they'll complete it over several years. Sometimes Germans will do that too, but it's quite common for North Americans to just do the whole trip at once if they can do it, because of the cost of flying overseas. And so, if you go online, you'll find out a lot about how kind of the rough budget of how much you can travel, and it's actually quite reasonable even if you don't know how to save money on the Camino. For most of the French way, it's about €5 a night if you do it during the summer to stay at an official pilgrim's hostel, and they call them albergues, and then in France they're called something auberge or something like that. About €5, upwards to 10. I didn't see a €15 until I got into the very, very last portion of the Camino. So your accommodation per night is actually quite cheap. And then there's quite commonly these buffets they have, which are €10, and it's just a feast usually. You get like 3-course meals and drinks and stuff. So for €10 you get this big thing. So, you know, the rough budget that a lot of people online will tell you is about €30. You know, roughly for food during the day, and then just these other random expenses that pop up. But I learned on the Camino, after traveling and meeting a few kind of really cool alternative pilgrims that kind of didn't do the tourist method of the Camino. You could camp. You can find these places called donativos, which are by donation, hostels for pilgrims, and you know, you just give whatever you can, and they actually usually feed you at the same time, depending on the place. So your costs can be driven down quite a bit. And to be honest, I think it's more of an authentic experience than what some other people experienced, because they would go for the hostels between €5 and €10. Some of them are religious hostels. They tend to be really, really basic. You won't find Wi-Fi. You will find likely like no modern day services in abundance. You might find a few, but then they have the state-run ones that tend to be a little bit better in terms of like more access to more modern day stuff, and then onwards up to private hostels, which is where you're going to pay the most money, and that's upwards of €15, usually 10, and you'll get the Wi-Fi. You usually get smaller rooms and all this crap. And so once I kind of figured out that there was donativos on the very bottom end of that scale, and the kind of people that sought those out, it was a very authentic experience, because you didn't have people that were going and treating this as if they were going on like a African like safari adventures, right? Like, oh, I walked across the this safari and surrounded by, surrounded by lions. And, they walked and they put some sweat in, but, like, really they were pretty comfortable the whole way. And there's some people that will be doing the Camino like that. They don't walk very far. They have brand new gear. They stay at the most modern, updated hostels. They buy the the €10 buffets, and the whole experience is quite comfortable. And that's where the Camino is starting to go. Unfortunately, I'd say it's a little bit less authentic that way, and you'll find more tourist shops in more and more towns, and more of the bars tend to cater to the pilgrims, and that's honestly their only economy in some of these towns that you stop in. And so there's that movement towards that direction, where more and more people from abroad hear about this, and it's more about just doing it as opposed to like doing it for some kind of spiritual reason or Catholic reason or something like that. So once you kind of find these alternative travelers, you learn how to camp, and if you're lucky, the weather will cooperate. You can bring a bag that will work for both hostel weather and outdoor night weather. In Spain, it tends to be pretty warm during the day in the summers. Again, I walked July, August. It was pretty hot, and luckily it didn't rain at all, except for the exception for 1 or 2 days. My main mistake was listening to the internet say no one camps. So I brought a bag that was really, really thin. It was kind of like a hostel bag. It was meant for indoor sleeping. And yeah, if I had brought one sleeping bag just a step a little bit warmer, I would have been fine in the hostel, just unzipping the bag, treating it more of a kind of like a duvet, as well as being able to layer up at night with this bag would have been perfect. And would have saved myself money. The idea being is every couple days you'd go find these donativos, or you would find one of the lower scale albergues, and you'd shower and you'd wash your clothing in those places. And then for eating, you just kind of skip these gigantic not buffet, but like these feast-like things that are really you don't need. They overfeed you, and it's kind of quite a waste of food in my mind. And you're probably perfectly capable of surviving off 10 euros could probably last you 3 days if you knew what you were doing. That's including wine. Like, you can get yourself a bottle of wine for a day or two. You get big chunks of fresh bread for a day or two. You get some fresh cheese, and maybe some meat, and you just throw yourself together some... There's even dumpster diving. I mean, not everyone can dumpster dive. If everyone did it, there wouldn't be dumpster diving. And not everyone's comfortable with it, and I get it if you don't know what you're doing. But that's an option that I saw quite a few of these alternative travelers try out when they could and save themselves some money. And they quite commonly sought out new friends on the Camino, and they were much more open to those kind of experiences. So they were less concerned about rushing to the next town, which was a mentality that was quite common on the Camino. It was very weird because so many people were so obsessed with like the idea of the Camino being a break from work, yet at the same time treating the Camino like it was a rat race. They would, walk exactly 25 to 30 kilometers a day. They'd walk to the same towns that everyone else was walking to, and they'd rush, because they were paranoid they wouldn't find a bed in the town, and like, oh my gosh, if they couldn't find a bed, right? So people would quite commonly get up at 5:30 a.m., walk till noon or 1, maybe 2, and then stay put for the rest of the day, and go to the bars in the town and eat, and just like it didn't seem like they were doing what the Camino could offer them. And so some of the folks I met would walk until they felt like stopping. They'd find rivers, they'd swim in them for hours, they'd walk past locals who, a few of my friends had guitars, and the locals would see the guitars and ask them to play, and before you know it, you're in the middle of a party. We'd walk alternative routes that no one else walked just for the sake of it, and honestly, every single time that happened, I had a way better time than this rat race kind of mentality that I had been absorbed in the first week. I spent way less money. I had way better experiences. I learned more Spanish. There was just a different way of doing it that a lot of people didn't pick up on, and they weren't necessarily looking for it, because again, the Camino is more and more and more becoming this kind of touristic flavor, like alternative tourism in a way. like, you can't deny that you're somewhat of a tourist if you're going to the Camino as an outsider with no, like, history of the Camino outside of, like, hearing your friend or your mom or your dad do it. But, there's definitely, like, a scale, you know, of how touristic you can make this experience, and you can definitely reduce that, even further. So if I was to do the Camino again, I would find a different way of getting to Europe, and I wouldn't just fly. And I had thought about doing that before, and taking a boat over, but it never came together, and I didn't have a lot of time and stuff. But I would definitely see if I could find a different way of getting to Europe. I would definitely plan for the Camino to be longer, so I never felt rushed, and I could stop when I felt like stopping. So, you know, again, I did it in 33 days, and I'd try to take 2 months next time. I would bring a better sleeping bag, so I could have the option of sleeping outside. I'd bring a sweater that was light enough that I could wear somewhat during the day, but layer up at night to keep warm if I wanted to camp. Another thing I really regretted doing, not being able to do, because I had shoved the trip into a month and a half, and then I took too long to start, and then I took too long to do it, is there's this option of walking to the coast, past Santiago, and that's called Finisterre, and it's the tradition is, it's like walking to the end of the world. You can't see anything past, and supposedly, historically, it was thought to be the end of the world, where, like, that was where everything just dropped off the flat earth. And so a lot of people will walk there, and that's kind of the real end to the journey, because Santiago itself is probably the most touristic of every part of of any part of the Camino. That was the place I actually felt the least comfortable, was just because it was just completely all about this touristic experience, and they had, like, the symbols everywhere, and you could buy the gift shop shit, and everyone by, you know, thousands would go to the cathedral and do the tradition of dropping to their knees and touching well, actually they can't touch the statue anymore because thousands of people have done, hundreds of thousands have done it every year, but they would do this, like, meaningless tradition that didn't mean anything to them. It was just kind of like what you did when you got there. And when I got to Santiago, I hated it. Actually, I was just like, fuck this, I want to go to Finisterre. So I would go and do Finisterre, because that was the journey was way more meaningful than the destination for me. So
how much farther is Finisterre?
An extra 100 or 150 kilometers, so
5 more days. If you
4 days probably. Like, if it's 100, I think if it was like 100 kilometers, then it'd be 3 or 4 days. Depending on how fast or how many kilometers you walk a day.
Yeah, if you walk much, then you walk like 30 a day.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I walked a little bit more than some people. I guess, like, some people with a little bit less physical abilities would walk. I think the lower end that someone might walk, like, more commonly, would be 25 kilometers. I walked 35 usually, 30 to 35 a day. I knew people who walked 50 kilometers, and I would never recommend anyone to walk that fast, even if they physically could. Like, I met some guys in the army that, you know, that's what they do for their job, right? So, like, 50 Ks, nothing, especially with, like, the packs. The rest of us are not used to carrying, like, a bag like this, full, and 10% of your body weight or more. Whereas, like, army guys can just, like, truck that, right? And so the army guys that I met that trucked it, they missed, I mean, they probably had fun still, but I suspect they probably missed out on a lot of cool opportunities because they just, you know, had this mentality they could finish it faster than everyone else, right? So, like, I can't tell you how many things that I got to see because I started later than everyone else. I walked later than everyone else. I walked alone if I could, so I could kind of look around more as opposed to this group mentality. And some people travel together, and not to say that every couple that walks together will do this, but they just tend to, like, again, it's a destination mode thing, right? Like, let's just get to the town so we can party more. And I don't know, I just didn't, that doesn't seem like the way to do it. I don't know why you do the Camino if it was all about partying at night. But, so, yeah, if I walk it again, I'd definitely take longer for sure.
What about other Caminos? Are you interested into other Caminos?
Yeah, so the other routes you mean?
No, other Caminos.
Like
other
pilgrimages.
Yeah.
Well, the actual, so I was thinking of doing another Camino itself. Like, there's a route called Camino del Norte, which is along the northern coast of Spain. It is like 1/10 the traffic, if not less. It's supposed to be gorgeous. It's just supposed to be like this beautiful coastline through the mountains most of the way. So it's physically it's much tougher. But I honestly think that's, like, after I've done, I think it's nice to do Camino de Francis first, because you get an idea what you're doing. And to start in Camino del Norte the first time is probably a little bit crazy. Not to say you can't do it, and maybe you should, but it's probably a good idea for people to start with Camino Francis. You get a lot more social interaction. I mean, it is fun to meet so many. I met people like no one's business. Even if I was walking alone every day, I met the most amazing people. And you'd see someone in the cafe once, and you'd see him a second time, and you were best friends. It was just like one of those really cool experiences where you just like, you just had this connection. So Camino Francis is good for that social experience. But now that I've had that behind me, and if I was to do another pilgrimage, specifically another Camino, I would do Camino del Norte and almost take it as a meditation trip in a way, you know, like really focusing on my mental processes as I travel, and really like perhaps having items to meditate on as I walk, kind of thing, things that I really want to work through, and just being like surrounded by more nature like that would be fantastic. And so I've met a lot of people who've done the Camino several times. Brad, my neighbor here, he's done it twice. He's done it once with his dad, once with Lindsay, and he'll probably go again. His dad will probably go again. So it's quite common for people to go again. And, you know, who knows, maybe I will. It's like one of those few travel experiences that really stuck with me in a way that it's never happened before. And I like traveling. And I've traveled before, and I enjoyed myself on other trips, but nothing stuck with me like the Camino did. So, if not Camino del Norte, honestly, I'd probably just make my own pilgrimage. I don't know if I would follow another kind of designated route. The good thing about the Camino is that you have those pieces of infrastructure in place. You have the towns that are used to pilgrims walking for you. You know, they have food. The towns are close together, so walking, you can walk to another town in a day. Even if it may be a longer day, like 40 kilometers, there's still a town within walking distance in case something goes wrong, or in case you get tired, or it's bad weather or something. To kind of walk across Canada, like I've contemplated, is quite the undertaking. It's not something to be taken lightly, right? Because you'll go a week without coming across a town. So you have to carry much more weight in terms of food and water. You need to have much more in place in terms of safety precautions, the kind of tools you'll have on you, the kind of gear you need to keep warm. So again, I've contemplated walking parts of Canada, and there's a Canadian trail that's being developed, not necessarily for walking, but for kind of biking and some of those trips, and it's kind of a network of trails throughout Canada, and parts of them have been built in Alberta. If I was to walk that, it would be a different kind of Camino.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Only in the very end, like in that last 100 kilometers, where you have this mass flux of Spanish people, to be honest, and where they wanted to join the Camino for their own kind of resume purposes, or maybe it was a family tradition, or like whatever. I'm not, I judge them, but I shouldn't. So in those instances, there was one night I couldn't find bed. One night, and I that was my own fault. I started late, I walked late, I walked slowly, stopped so many times, and I had already been used to camping at that point, so I wasn't too worried. I think I pulled into town at 9 p.m., so it was like quite, and it's a small town, right? So the smaller towns with only one albergue, you're probably not going to find a place. I don't even think I went to the hostel to double check, to be honest. Like, I ran into somebody else, and they were like, I was like, okay, I'm just going to go find a place to camp. So, for all I know, they had a place. In the beginning, people were talking about it, and they were worried about it, and no, it wasn't a problem. There was one town, again, it was like kind of a similar experience where there's 2 hostels. I checked one, didn't even bother checking the other. Someone had said like it might be full, and I felt like keeping walking. And there was another town within 5 kilometers, and I got a hostel there. So this like obsession with not having a place to stay is probably unfounded for most of the Camino. But again, like if you are looking for more of an alternative experience, and you're prepared to maybe sleep outside if you can, then like you should not make that a reason to rush. So there's no like campgrounds anywhere that I saw. I don't think camping is as nearly as popular in Spain as it might be here in Canada. Or at least maybe not along the Camino. So if you were camping, it was kind of just finding a place out of the way where no one was going to bother you and you weren't going to bother anyone else. The few places I camped were, you know, in the mountains, completely in bumfuck nowhere. In a cave one night. The one night I slept completely by myself. I just kind of walked up the path, about a kilometer out of town, turned off the path so I was within like 30 meters of the path, but hidden from anyone that was walking towards the direction of Santiago, and I was fine. Although I found the camp really late, and so I didn't really have I had a flashlight, I think, but not a very good light. And the next morning I discovered I was sleeping in a spot where I think a few people had taken a shit.
Oh no.
That was pretty awful. I wake up and I just kind of like look over and I'm like, I have a feeling that's human feces. And I don't think I was sleeping in it, but like pretty close to it. Oh well.
Happens to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I met some families that did camping, and so they moved a tent around and they just found a field. You know, you're probably okay in a field, okay. Whereas I would try to find places under trees and stuff. Yeah. I think so, because you're going to have a lot more professions that are able to take time off during that time. However, it's the hottest season, so some people are really bothered by the heat, and it was pretty hot. You know, especially when you're walking through part of the Camino called the Meseta, which is like kind of a really hot, dry, arid prairie kind of experience. Hot and flat, so a lot of people really didn't like that, and even people would get so like uncomfortable with the idea of doing this. There was people that actually took a bus and skipped like that 150 kilometers. I don't know why you do that. I actually love that part because I'm not bothered by heat as some other people were, and it was quieter, less people. And that was awesome for me because my favorite part was like getting on a stretch of road where I couldn't see anyone and I couldn't hear anyone, and I was just completely in my own head thinking. That was my favorite part. And the Meseta was great for that, you know, like there was less distractions too. I mean, it was just a really simple kind of beauty, and you were absorbed by that beauty, but there wasn't like a billion mountains and trees and things happening where you were just like completely always looking somewhere else. You could really get inside your own head. So anyway, the point being is some people are bothered by the heat, but the way people got around that was they'd start walking earlier. So they'd start walking at 5:30, 6:30, and I specifically started walking at 7 to 8:30ish, depending on the day, so I could avoid people and I could have the road to myself. Yeah, like I said, I wasn't bothered by the heat. I could take the heat a little bit better than other people. I did 2 months in Cuba during the most humid and hottest season in Cuba the year before. So I mean, that was like 30 degrees. Are you kidding me? It wasn't even hot. It wasn't even humid. So farm in Cuba with an organization from Canada that was partnered with an organization in Cuba that got us involved in permaculture specifically in Cuba. So that was also a really cool experience here before. But I guess one last comment on the season. Yeah, I think that's the busiest season that the Camino has is July, August. You're gonna have more hostels open in those like summer months, so more places to stay, more towns that you could stay in. And then there's the shoulder seasons. The spring has a tendency to rain, so I knew people that went in May, June. I was originally going to walk May, June. I'm so glad I didn't, because it was like the flood rain season, and that was like the year that the Pyrenees flooded, and I think Tour de France was partially like rerouted, which is almost unheard of. So yeah, May to June has a tendency to be much wetter but colder, so it's nicer for people who don't like the heat. And then the opposite shoulder season is the season that some of my friends have walked, which is later August, September, and into October. You still have most of the hostels open, but far less people, and it's colder, and it doesn't have as much of a tendency to rain. So there's that. I would probably walk September if I could, but I'm fine with July, August. If I was to do Camino del Norte, I'd walk in the July, August. And I guess the last note is if you walk in the winter, which is done, not commonly, but there's people who walk in the winter. Spain actually has a pretty cold winter. Not as cold as parts of Canada, but snow at points and minuses at points.
Yeah. Does the Camino partially go over the mountains as well? Over like
it goes through 2 mountain ranges. So it goes Camino Francis goes through the Pyrenees, and then in the very later stages of the Camino, it goes through Galicia, which has a mountain range there. It's a very small one, but specifically Galicia, I think, tends to be pretty cold and humid. So I can imagine that would be pretty miserable in the winter. It actually has a climate that's very similar to Scotland, apparently. And there's a very Gaelic culture in that part of Spain. It's the weirdest experience to show up in. There's bagpipes and people with like kilts, like in Spain. It's so weird. And with Gaelic names, like towns are Gaelic. There was actually a point where there was like a point of a couple hundred years where the Celts had invaded that part of Spain, so they had left their influence, and Galicia tends to be pretty separatist when it comes to Spanish politics. So they, they're always these outcasts. It's kind of like Quebecois in Canada. They just want to separate, but they don't really have much of their own economy. Except for the Camino, and Santiago de Compostela is actually in the province of Galicia. So it's a pretty big deal for the Camino, or for Galicia to have the Camino there, and I think that's their only economy. So they don't really have a separatist ability to separate. So I would say the shoulder seasons and probably the September season. My friends Brad and Lindsay that did it, they said there was like 1/10 the amount of traffic you'd normally see, and they like never once came close to having a full hostel. And there's this place in Santiago. I didn't see myself because I'm way too busy, but there's a hotel in Santiago that used to be a pilgrim's hostel traditionally. It was bought out. I think it must have been national before. It was nationalized, and then it was bought out after. And with the sale, it was kept that they would still continue to feed a certain amount of pilgrims every day. So there's it's like 10 pilgrims they'll feed a day. So nothing like what they used to feed in the hundreds. But so if you show up at the back of the door of the hotel, if you know where to go, and you're the first 10, you'll get fed. And I sent the package. They failed to communicate what I had to do to pick it up. and and they failed to communicate when I'd be arriving in Santiago. And so when I got to Santiago, I called. I actually had the hostel staff to call on my behalf, and thank God for that woman. She was so nice. She calls, and they tell her that they sent my entire package back to the town I had sent it from 3 weeks earlier, and that the only way to get it was for me to get it in person, and I had to get it in the next couple of days. Lo and behold, I'm going to Portugal the next day. I have no ability to get to this town in the day and then get back, and I'm just like, oh my god, there goes my $1,500 unit. Like, oh my fucking god. And my juggling balls, I really like my juggling balls. And so I was kind of freaking out, and I got to a point where I accepted that I lost my camera. And she was on the girl at the hostel, she, bless her heart, she was on the phone for like 2 hours calling different postal agents and trying to figure out where my camera was, and trying to figure out if she could arrange to get my camera sent from the town that I had sent it from back to Santiago without anyone having to sign it. And if they could do that, then she was either going to send it to me in Canada, and we like worked out how much money that was going to be, and if she couldn't afford that, or if it wasn't going to be worth it, she was going to sell the camera in Spain and wire me the money. And I honestly think she was like true to that. Like, she was very honest and nice. Anyways, it was just like hours of work, and I got to this point where I was just like, it's just a camera. It's just a camera. It's a $1,500 camera. I will never be able to buy another camera, but it's just a camera. And so I think what ended up happening is she called one last time. She's like, God damn it, I'm going to figure this one out. And she called, and lo and behold, it was right in Santiago. It was like 2 blocks away from me. It was just like, yeah, it was just like, there's no return address, so they wouldn't have sent it back to the town I sent it from. And it's like a pilgrim's package, so just like in the pilgrim special. So someone just didn't know that they wouldn't do that, and they assumed that because I hadn't picked it up over a given amount of time, they'd send it back to a return, and that's what they told the girl. But in fact, it was just waiting for me, and I had to just go over and sign. And it was like 5 minutes after that phone call, I had it in my hands. Like, ridiculous. So if you ever go to Spain to do the Camino and you use this postal service, by God, bring someone who can speak well enough Spanish to have a conversation about postal. Because I could speak well enough about food, places to stay, directions, but I had no vocabulary for like postal services. So yeah, no, that was a nightmare. So that's my advice to you,
Cool.
you viewer, whoever you are.